Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Your zip code is a better predictor of how long you'll live than your cholesterol, blood pressure, and even your genetic code. That might be surprising to many. Think about that again. Your zip code is a better predictor. And that's not hyperbole, folks. That is a scientific fact. Your zip code is a better predictor than many measures of your overall health on how long you'll live. Why is that important? Well, it's the basis of today's conversation, addressing racism and policing in America. In the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd by a police officer, as I'm sure you all are aware of the mass marches, demonstrations, and even some protests that are taking place across the nation, and a few riots as well. We're going to look at today making the distinction between these because we think it's essential that we're clear on what's what and who's doing things the right way and who's not. But we're also going to look at possible solutions because that's a big part of what the State of Us addresses. Where do we go from here? A lot of people want change. Do they know what change they want? And what are some of the options that might actually make a difference? That's what we're going to look at today on the State of Us. But of course, we couldn't begin a conversation on America, history, and racism without
True Chat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Well, good day, folks. We really need you to have on your your good listening ears today, because we're going to talk about some things that are ultra sensitive, and we understand that sensitivity, but we need to have the conversations to address where we go from here to try to improve things. I don't think any of us would, or at least very few of us would argue that things don't need to be improved in our society and make things better. The conversation needs to take place on how do we get there. And that's what we're going to try to do today.
Obviously, we want to start out by making sure people remember if this is your first time listening or if you've recently started listening, you may not be aware, but Lance is a boomer and I'm a millennial. We're both white males that have spent the majority of our lives in the Midwest. And so that the reason we're starting out by providing that background is we just want to be open and transparent about that. We think it's important that everybody in the nation be involved in the conversation right now. And obviously our show has been about for many years those honest, open, and respectful conversations. So we're trying to start by being real honest with you about the position that we both come from in that regard. So Lance, with that, let's talk a little bit about, this is something you and I have discussed on a few different occasions, the marches versus demonstrations versus protests versus riots. One of the things that I've observed, and I think you have too, we talked about this, is a lot of attention is always paid. I mean, anytime, right, that there's rioting, and what do we mean by that? Destruction of property, illegal things occurring. When that starts to happen, it tends to get a lot of coverage, but it doesn't mean that it's the majority or even a significant portion of most demonstrations, right? I mean, in a lot of cases, you're talking about 90%, 95%, or 99% of people who are demonstrating are doing so peacefully and abiding by the law. So I think you and I wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that that started to taper off, it seems like, right, over the last week or two. Some of the violent portion of things has calmed down a little bit. But obviously that distinction, I think, is important. And also understanding that a lot of those bad actors are often just taking advantage of the situation, right? Not necessarily doing it for the right reasons.
Right. There are people who just want to be destructive, number one. There are people that their rage is so high that they overreact, I would say, I guess is the best word I can come up with. And then there are people that we have talked about, read about, that are coming in from our outside agitators as well. But it seems like in the last week or so that the stronger voices have been winning out, and the media has done a better job of showing people speaking out and saying, we're not here to cause damage. There have actually been stories and videos of people trying to stop looters and stop people from destroying property. But I'm very hopeful that we can continue to improve and make it better.
You talked about, it seems like there's consensus around the nation, or to the extent that there ever is in this country. It seems that the country is in alignment that something needs to be done. Now, what needs to be done, that's part of what we're going to talk about in the second segment. But I wanted to say, to that point, our small town of Urbana had a protest actually over the past weekend, and had a couple hundred people show up for that. And it was peaceful, and it even involved a couple members of the police department who spoke and who marched with the protesters. And I wanted to mention that because I think it's so important. We have listeners, Lance, obviously all over the country, big cities, small cities. It's one of those things that reminds us that certain things tend to transcend all demographic areas and all places of the country. And I think it speaks to your point about this is something that everybody's feeling. Something needs to happen.
Yeah, this has reached everywhere. And there was to speak to that, there was another scene. I think it was in Atlanta the other day, where right before curfew set in, the National Guardsmen started dancing with the protesters in a little bit of levity to show that we're not here to, beat up on anybody or anything else, which we've had in our, again, the word recent, I guess when you're my age, recent is a little bit longer than somebody your age, but in recent history, we've had National Guard and police do those kinds of things publicly and be supported. And in this case, I think people are trying to show across the board, wherever they're coming from, that, yeah, we all agree that what happened here and what's been happening, and, Mr. Floyd's case, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. It seems to have just brought everybody together, or to bring the consensus together that, okay, we've watched this enough and it's time to try to make some changes. We've tried to make changes before and thought things were, hopefully getting better. And now the consensus is it's not good enough and we need to do some more. The majority of us think it's time to do something about it. And I think it goes across all racial and socioeconomic levels right now, which is great. That's when change takes place, is when you can include all the different groups that are going to be affected.
Well, and politically too. I mean, I think that's a big key, right? With Washington being gridlocked on so many issues, when you have Republicans and Democrats who are not only feel that change is needed, but are actively calling for it and are actively working on it, we're the most likely to actually get something done. Now, what's going to be done? Will it be effective? That's what we're talking about coming up. But the last thing I want to mention, Lance, because I think this is really important. You were talking about recent is different for people of different ages, right? And recency bias is a real thing for people of all ages. I've heard people of all ages, but particularly millennials, Gen Z, and even some Gen Xers saying things like, we've never gone through this before, and this is the worst it's ever been in our history, and this is a moment of racial reckoning that we've never encountered, and on and on. And that isn't to say, I just want to be real clear, that's not to say that the current situation isn't bad, but it is also incorrect to say this is the worst it's ever been. I mean, I don't think that's necessarily a matter of opinion. I think it's more of a matter of historical fact. The country has been through larger racial uprisings. We fought a war where more Americans died than any other war that we've ever fought over the issue. So I think to suggest that this is, the pinnacle, I'm not sure that that's necessarily accurate. It also, the reason that's bad is it does a disjustice to what we've already been through. And it also makes people skeptical of our ability to come through this. And I think what you need right now, right, is no, we've faced down things before like this and this very issue before. And no, it's not fixed. But we have a track record of continuing, maybe not fast enough, continuing to make changes. So we should be able to make even more changes now that move us forward. I think that's how I would change the message, I guess, is kind of the point, Lance.
We've always talked in the last 7 or 8 years on this show that we begged people to get involved and have their voices heard. And it is redeeming and exciting to see that is being done right now. That people, because we've always said, you said, well, politically things that yes, that's because people are getting out and being heard. And this is where the power in our government rests with the people. The people can have a big influence on what government does. They just have to get out there and let the government officials know how they feel. And this has caused that to ignite and happen. And whether again, we don't agree with any violence, but the idea that people are out there peacefully marching and protesting and getting people's attention to make changes is exactly what we've been talking about on this show for years. So that part of it is very exciting to see and very rewarding.
We're going to look at where do we go from here? Some discussion around defunding has been coming up. Is the way to go to defund police departments across the nation? What's the federal government's role, your state government's role, and your local government's role? We're going to look at all of that and more. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Your zip code is a better predictor of longevity than your cholesterol, blood pressure, and even genetics. I hope that sinks in. I mentioned it. That was part of the opening monologue today. And I'm really hoping that people take a minute to think about the impact of that. Lance and I have talked about housing a lot. That has been a thing that has been a recurring theme over the years. The housing crisis in America, the statistics that come with what zip code you're in, the neighborhood you live in, and the opportunities that you have based on where you come from. It's really hard when you don't come from one of those places, or even when you do, to picture the opposite scenario. But I think for this portion of the show where we talk about solutions, it's so critical because a lot of these things, as always seems to be the case, Lance, is there are some immediate things that can be done, but to address the problem long term, there's underlying things that have to be taken care of if you ever want it to really be changed permanently. And so the first thing that we want to talk about is this has kind of been proposed. I was a little, I don't know if surprised is the right word. I guess I was a little disappointed, Lance, when the conversation has significantly has started to come into the mainstream. Some states, mainly some local municipalities, starting to consider defunding their police forces. I'm afraid this is one of those makes us feel good in the moment, doesn't fix anything long-term issues. Because I don't see, and maybe you may help me, Lance, here, but I don't see so we take money away from the police department and or just disband the police department, and then what? I mean, what? Okay, we don't have police, or okay, they don't have money, but that doesn't stop the police that are left from doing a bad job. Or if we get police gone altogether, that opens up a whole new host of things. It feels like that's a reactionary thing to an emotional situation, which I appreciate that people are upset, but I'm not sure. Help me here, Lance. I don't know. What are we hoping to accomplish? What are we hoping to accomplish with that? What's the goal?
Well, it's been done twice before. So we have in Compton, California, and in Camden, New Jersey, to some level, this defunding. And there's some myths there in your thought that if we defund, the police are gone. No, the theory behind this and the reasoning behind it is there are many situations out there amongst people that we put police officers in that maybe they're not trained to deal with, and that it would be better, the community would be better served to have police enter those situations where they are trained to enter them and not have them enter situations where they're not trained as well as other people in a field, take, for example, if there is a some kind of domestic violence dispute that weapons aren't involved, maybe we would be better served to take that money that we spend on policing and hire psychologists, or to hire people who are trained in desensitizing those kinds of incidents. Or if there's a drug problem, that we bring in drug counselors instead of police officers with a gun, so that when tempers start to flare or somebody feels threatened, or you bring a weapon into a situation, then there's always that possibility that it could escalate into something that it wasn't to begin with. So my understanding and my short reading of defunding is it's not that police officers don't serve a purpose. They serve a very important purpose, and the people asking for defunding understand they serve that purpose. But what we've done in the last few decades is ask police to take on more and more roles that they aren't necessarily trained to do. And therefore, then we put people in situations that they're not trained properly to handle, and then negative things happen that way. So that's the theory behind it, and it makes sense. And I'm not here promoting it necessarily or saying it's a bad idea either. I'm not making a judgment call on it, but it's not, well, we're just going to get rid of the police department because we don't need the police and they're bad. No, that's not what defunding says. It says that, unfortunately, we keep asking the police to do more and more things, and that's not what the police are for. Let's go back and let's figure out the core incidents and the core values we want the police to have, and what do we want them dealing with. And then, okay, we have that. All right, now we have these other problems in our society. Okay, who do we want to take care of those problems? We determine that the police aren't the best people to take care of these social issues. So where are we going to take the money that used to be given to police to handle this problem, and who are we going to hire to now take care of these problems? That's my understanding of defunding.
Make the distinction between defunding versus disbanding, because they're not the same thing. And I think that's
not the same
right.
thing. The words don't mean the same. It's just, how about if we better allocate our funds to create a better society?
We talk about all the time on the show, right? Communication's a big deal. And I think a lot of people can read defunding. And just so our listeners know, I was playing a little bit of the questioner there, and I was somewhat aware of what Lance was going to say, so I don't want people to think that I hadn't read about some of the defunding proposals. But I think that's a legitimate question that a lot of people have, because you hear defunding, and I think what comes to mind for a lot of people is you're taking the money away, which is what you're doing, but it doesn't mean that you're taking all of the money away, right? So reallocating may be a more useful word when we're talking about, as communities look to do this, what to do.
Well, there's anecdotal evidence of some police officers saying, I don't want to go into this situation. This is not why I became a police officer. I don't know why I'm dealing with this social issue. This would be better handled by somebody by a sociologist or a psychologist or, a marital counselor. This is not my training. So why am I being put in these situations when this isn't what I was trained or hired to do? And with that anecdotal evidence, then it makes sense. Okay. We just need to put the right people in the right situations to deal with society's issues.
The key is understanding that this could be, and that's part of what Lance and I have discussed. The challenge here is it has a lot to do with how it is done, and making sure that this kind of leads into our next thing, Lance, this Fed versus state versus local, right? Different municipalities, different communities they're going to have different levels of feasibility to do this. We know there's police departments around the country that are underfunded, and I'm using air quotes there because, again, our funding terminology, while there are others where where it's really feasible to reallocate some money, take some of that burden off the officers. In the areas where they're underfunded, you have to ask, then how do we find funding for some of these things that we're asking police to do right now that they shouldn't be responsible for, or at least they shouldn't be responsible for unless we're going to pay them more and train them better to handle these things. It's the same thing. You're not going to ask the electrician to fix the plumbing unless they've been certified, unless they're also a plumber.
Well, and should they be the first line of defense? Is there a better first option? And I think that's important to understand, is that police officers, and thank you very much for those of you who are police officers. I appreciate the work that the majority of you do. And, an old song, one bad apple don't spoil the whole bunch. We can't look at the entire family of police and policing based on the bad actions of a few. Most of them are doing the job and doing the best they can and want to help make society a better place. But we need to help them. And so we need to find a way for them to be effective at what they do. And I think they would want and welcome that help. And I don't want to speak for them, but I think they would like that help.
Most of them, yeah. I think it's a big part of it, right? Is not being asked. I mean, just like if you're any professional, you don't want people to expect you to be good at doing something that you're not qualified to handle and then get mad at you if you don't handle it well. I mean, part of that is also the reasonable expectations for what people are qualified to do, and not asking people who are not qualified to handle certain things to handle things they haven't been trained for.
But money is the issue, as you said. And I'm just going to say it that way, that money's the issue, because most of the studies show that community policing helps the situation. The more you can put police in the neighborhoods and have them walking around and be visible and get them out of their cars, the relationship between the police and the community improves. The problem is that costs a lot of money, because a person on foot or on bicycle cannot cover as much as a person in a patrol car. And so we do have some things that we have used in the past that we know work, but it does cost money. And so there's, as you said, where we're going to find the money. Part of the issue is how much money are we willing to spend to create this better society that we want.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about the process of change, because I think that's important. We had a good conversation about defunding, making sure people understand what exactly that is, hoping to dispel some of the concerns people have, which are legitimate concerns, about what that could mean and what it would look like. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the federal versus state versus local's role. Lance mentioned community policing, and also what's at the root of the problem. Lance kind of brought it up a little bit here, and we talked about the zip code issue, but we want to expand on that a little bit more and provide hopefully some expectations of what change might look like. To find out where we go from here, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
The government plays a big role in most of our lives, and of course is responsible for the creation and the overall administration of our law enforcement and other first responders. So as we talk about where we go from here, it's important to not only discuss what possibilities there are, but also to talk about what are some reasonable expectations in terms of what can get done, how fast, and really what does it take to make that happen. Before we get to that, though, we want to wrap up with the root of the problem. Lance and I have been covering the quote-unquote housing crisis in the United States for a few years, and I feel like, Lance, it continues to be, maybe now it'll finally start to get some more attention. It's one of those things that a lot of our officials know it's a problem, but a lot of people, because it's a little bit more nuanced in its nature, a lot of people don't have a good comprehension that it's a really serious problem. And what do we mean by that? Well, it's a big, and that's the other thing, it's a big category that covers a lot of different areas. Everything from people not being able to afford good housing to neighborhoods becoming poorer and poorer and wealthier neighborhoods becoming wealthier and wealthier. And that plays a huge role in that statistic that I shared twice now, that your zip code is a better predictor of longevity than cholesterol, blood pressure, and even genetics. Why is that? Because we have basically allowed our country to become less diverse in its neighborhoods, which leads to more predictability in terms of poverty, which is a huge factor of overall longevity. The poorer area you live in, generally speaking, the shorter life you will have. Because access to education is worse, access to better paying jobs is worse, which means access to medicine is worse. All playing into that overall lower quality of life, overall lower life expectancy. And I think that speaks to, we know that minority communities, particularly Black communities, are disproportionately affected by this because a lot of what's left over from hundreds of years of racial segregation. So I know that was a lot to throw at people, but I think the bottom line of that is part of what you have to do if you're going to fix this is, like Lance said, you have to decide how much you're willing to spend, and you have to get serious about lifting up neighborhoods and making it easier for neighborhoods to become more diverse and bring back some of that upward mobility, because that's part of the problem. People who are not familiar with neighborhoods go into them. Neighborhoods have stigmas. Why do they have stigmas? A lot of times unfairly, but also because areas with lower poverty tend to be areas of higher crime. And so if the Black community is disproportionately affected by that, it leads people to unjustly go in predisposition to believe that really bad things are going to happen here. But again, that transcends just Black communities. That's all low income, high poverty areas experience higher crime rate and more problems with health, drugs, etc., because of the situation they're in. So you want to fix some of this problem long term. I think it's a combination of funding community policing, continuing to get serious about that, and also addressing in a real way the housing situation.
We have done this in the past and periodically. And, I was just watching a documentary and it showed Dr. King in 1968 making it a war on poverty, and wasn't making it racial, but a war on poverty. And many of the things you mentioned make me hearken to that time when we addressed it. And I won't say the last time, but one of the major times in my memory. And as always, we make changes and we hope it worked. And we built some of these places, and communities where this will solve the problem. Well, now advance 40 years later, and those didn't work. That doesn't mean that the changes we tried to make were wrong. It was, we tried to make the changes. It means they didn't work. And that is part of what needs to be, I think, discussed now that we're looking to change again. The change needs to take place, because the changes that we made that we thought would take care of the problem did not fix the problem. And that happens. Sometimes when you make change, it works, and it works just the way you want it to, and things get better. Sometimes you make the change and through no fault of anybody, it doesn't work the way you wanted it to. Okay. That doesn't mean that the process of trying to change was the wrong thing to do. The process of changing is correct. What you changed didn't solve the problem. Okay. Trial and error, scientific method, use whatever term you want to there. But that means, okay, let's work again. So we've tried some things, and as the old guy on the show, I will say things are better now than when I was growing up. I'm not saying things are good. I'm not saying we solved all the problems. I'm not saying that even closely. We still have many major problems that we need to deal with, but things are better than they were. Okay. But now it's time, and the majority of us agree we need to make some other changes. We've improved it, but as you pointed out, Justin, there are still many discrepancies in our neighborhoods and in our cities and in different parts of our country where we have all kinds of issues that we need to deal with. So let's deal with them. the mood of the country is, we need to make some changes. So let's make some further changes and see where that takes us. But I want to make sure people understand that just because you change doesn't mean it's going to get better. That doesn't mean we don't change. I'm all for the change. We need to try some new things to see if we can further advance our society towards a greater equality for all. We need to do that. Just understand that we all need to stay diligent, because when we make these changes down the road, it may not all play out the way we want it to play out. And we're going to need to address it again and adapt to another change, or keep what works and try something different. Don't just assume that, oh, wow, I was all part of this movement and we changed it and now everything's going to be great, and then be disgruntled and dismayed when it doesn't make the kind of change that you want it to. I hope it does. I really hope it does. But if it doesn't, that doesn't mean that we just quit on it.
Lance and I were actually talking about President Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, before the show. And, he did a lot of monumental things, the New Deal obviously being one of the substantial ones. And he actually said right at one point, take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But by all means, try something. And I think this speaks to the approach of, we know certain components of the New Deal didn't work so well, and we know other ones did. But the point was we needed to try something. And so that was the approach that was taken. And I think that's the approach here. And to Lance's point, we have tried to solve the housing crisis before. It feels like we've sort of given up in recent years, or that there's not the same attention because we got discouraged, because it's like, oh, well, we tried, we built these new housing projects, right? And we moved people in and it didn't fix anything. So, and in some cases it made things worse. So we can't fix it. So we're done. And it's like, no, we have to try something else. There's a lot of ideas out there. And unfortunately, and this is the thing I know people don't like, I don't like it, these things don't happen overnight. I mean, how much, Lance, was invested, right, in, the attempt to build affordable housing in all these different places. And I mean, it was a massive failure by many measures, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars spent, and little to nothing to show for it. And in some cases, negative process as a result of going this route. Okay, so it didn't work. So now we know we're not going to do that. We have to try something different. But unfortunately, sometimes we try these things and you invest years to try them, and then it's really upsetting when they don't work. But I think that's the overall point, is we have to keep trying, because the only way we're going to get there is by trying different things, seeing if they work, and moving forward. I think that's one of the things that's not being discussed a lot, is by a lot of measures, when you read into a lot of what the Minneapolis Police Department was doing, they were working and implementing a lot of different things to try to make changes. Obviously, it didn't happen fast enough to prevent the killing of George Floyd, which is terrible. It's awful. But it's also to understand that these things do take time. And even in places where it's actively being attempted to be fixed, unfortunately, it's not something that's going to happen overnight, because you are talking about not only changing the way society functions, but the cultural mindset of society, which is something that takes even longer to do and is even harder to do. But the message has to be that we have to keep trying.
But it also points to that maybe the direction to go is to take some things off of the plate of the police, because police districts across the United States have had all kinds of training, and these problems are still occurring. So therefore, the solution isn't to continue to train the police in all these different measures. Maybe let's get the police back to doing what they are created to do, and let them concentrate on that. And the change needs to be, let's find other ways to solve some problems that we've thrown on the plate of the police. And just to close on my part, it is a process and it will take time, but we don't quit. We're Americans. We can find an answer. We can continue to work for it, and we can create a better place to live. That's been our dream forever. We've made mistakes. We've done some things wrong. We've not always done the right thing, but we are ones that, okay, we've seen the problem. Let's stare it down and let's fix it and let's try to make it better. And that's the message I hope that we continue to have as long as I live, however long that may be, and past my lifetime, is that don't be afraid of change. Don't be afraid of the process, and continue and strive to make America a more equitable country for everybody.
A more perfect union, perhaps?
I guess so. I'm not trying to stay away from all the phraseologies so nobody connects it to anything political. This is all just about us as people learning to live with one another in an equitable fashion and a fair fashion so that everybody's treated the same, no matter for race, creed, color, gender, anything. All of that should be thrown out the window when we treat each other as human beings and treat each other in the most equitable manner that we can. And we need to do something to advance that. We've advanced it before. It's obviously time to advance it again.
Define the role of the police, train them for the job, and decide who handles the rest, and make sure that you fund who's ever in charge of the rest. Also, obviously, like we've talked about many, many times, housing crisis has to continue to be a top priority. You have to not only take care and prepare the people whose job it is to keep neighborhoods safe, but make sure that neighborhoods themselves have the ability to be safe and to be places for prosperity and that are not completely poverty ridden. That shouldn't be the case in hopefully the greatest country in the world. Excuse me. But that's what we have time for today, Lance. I think it's one of those things. It's a huge conversation. We encourage people to go look up some of the other times we've talked about this. thestateofus.org has a lot of different resources there. All of our past episodes, we've talked about the housing crisis. We've talked about policing before. So please go check them out. And Lance, why did you and I take time to have this conversation today? What was our objective?
Well, as you alluded to in your monologue to open the show, our mission here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I think we've done that. And if you agree, let us know. And if we did not, please let us know, because that's part of honest and respectful conversations. If we've said some things that you like, we'd like to hear from you. If you say some things that we don't like, please leave us messages at True Chat and let us know so that we can continue this discussion and so we can make the changes that we need to improve the equality in our country. If you need to, please share with your friends so that they can listen to us. If you've liked this program and you like the message that it's sending, please share with your friends how they can get a hold of us. And of course, as a podcast, you can find us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and anywhere else fine podcasts are found. So get the word out and spread the message. That's all part of this process.
Episodes of the podcast are released Tuesdays and Thursdays. Be sure to keep an eye out for those. And everybody that listens to this program as a syndicated radio show tends to find it on the weekends, so be sure to check your local station. For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch. And thank you all. You're the ones that make all of this worth it. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.